Hello again, folks, and welcome to another bonus episode of Season 5. This is the first part of our interview with scholar Ben Kiernan, Professor of International Affairs and Director of the Genocide Studies Program at Yale University. In this first half of the conversation, we speak with Ben about the years of French colonialism, which he's also very well versed on, how that shaped Cambodia, and the Lon Nol period, and whether or not some of the crimes of the Lon Nol regime may be part of a wider scope of genocide in Cambodia than was acknowledged in the UN Tribunal against the Khmer Rouge. Enjoy. First question here. In our show, we go back a certain ways to contextualize how the table was set for the 20th century and the wars and events that we cover. So with that in mind, what was the origin of modern nationalism in Cambodia? It was different in certain ways from what was happening in Vietnam and elsewhere. In what ways was it different, and in what ways was it similar?
Well, Cambodian anti-colonialism began almost immediately with the French takeover of Cambodia in the 1860s. There were rebellions against the French takeover in the 1860s and in the 1880s, which went on until the 1890s. But it wouldn't be right to call that modern nationalism. It was serious resistance to the French in the conquest of Cambodia, but not what later became modern nationalism. That took a while to develop. It was probably in the 1930s that modern nationalism first began to show signs in Cambodia. It was first associated with Cambodian Buddhism and Buddhist institutions. They were in particular the foundation of the higher school of Pali, Pali being the Latin of Buddhism. The higher school of Pali was founded in 1914, and then an institution founded to develop the first Khmer language dictionary in the 1920s that got going. And then in 1930, the foundation of the Buddhist Institute in Phnom Penh, which was a major intellectual development. And two people who worked for that Buddhist Institute from 1930 on were later to go on to be founders of what you could call modern Khmer nationalism, both its secular and its communist branches. They were Sun Yat-sen, who was the founder or the co-founder of the first Khmer newspaper, which was founded by him and another Khmer in 1936, and another former employee of the Buddhist Institute was a Buddhist layman, Achar Sok, who under the name Tu Samut later became the leader of the Khmer communist movement. So they both were former employees and activists in the Buddhist Institute in the 1930s. But it was small, the Khmer modern nationalist movement in the 1930s and early 40s, and really did not get going in a more significant way until the late 1940s.
And what did these acts of resistance, protests, uprisings against the French look like? What forms did they take? Were they peasant-based earlier on? What was the role of the intellectuals? Certainly by the 1930s, that was a developing influence. And were they right-wing, left-wing? What was the picture there?
Well, the late 19th century rebellions were violent and were put down violently by the French. In the early 20th century, there was a large mass non-violent peasant demonstration or series of demonstrations in 1915 and 1916 where Cambodian peasants mobilized and gathered and marched on Phnom Penh during World War I to protest the high taxes that the French were imposing on Cambodian peasants in their land holdings. That was a rather significant development. It was not organized, as far as we can tell, by intellectuals, who had not yet come to the fore in anti-French movement during World War I. And again in 1925, peasants protested the increase in taxes in a district in west central Cambodia, where again it seems to have been a spontaneous or peasant organized local movement where 5 villages of peasants mobilized and ended up getting into a fight with the local French district commissioner, and he was killed. But later on, after the foundation of not only the Buddhist Institute in 1930, but the Indochina Communist Party in 1930, some Cambodians took part in the latter as less active members. Most of the members of the Indochina Communist Party were Vietnamese, but some Cambodians did take part in it at a relatively junior level in the 1930s in Cambodia. But most of the activity in Cambodia was conducted by ethnic Vietnamese members of that minority group in Cambodia. Yeah. This was quite different from the situation in places like other parts of Southeast Asia, like Burma, for instance, where the nationalist movement was much more advanced at that time, by that time, and even much earlier, because the British, who were the colonizers of Burma, had placed much more emphasis on educating local Burmese than the French did in Cambodia with the Cambodians. And, for instance, in 1908, I think it was, 6 Burmese graduated from English law schools and returned to Burma as barristers. And there was nothing like that level of education granted to Cambodians by the French. In fact, by the time the first Cambodian newspaper was formed by Sun Yat-sen, formerly of the Buddhist Institute, in 1936, there were still only 60,000 Cambodians attending primary schools in Cambodia. It was a very limited modern education system that the French established after 60 or 80 years of colonialism in Cambodia.
Maybe to segue to Prince Sihanouk, I remember reading that he was, for whatever reasons maybe you could fill in, he was pretty keen on education being addressed and built a lot of schools because of French neglect in their colonization of Cambodia, especially compared to Vietnam. We talk about how he was originally picked by the French for being a pliant young man, and he played nice with the Japanese as well. But by the time of the First Indochina War, he's pretty deft at playing everyone against the other. And so by the time the Cold War is in full swing, the United States are wary of him, and he's wary of the United States. What did the White House and the American government have against a neutral Cambodia at that point, all the way back even in the 50s?
Well, firstly, you're right to say that Sihanouk dramatically changed the policy towards education, which had been under the French until 1954, very limited in terms of developing even primary education in Cambodia, let alone secondary or university education. And so there was a very small intellectual class in Cambodia and a small number of people with a secondary education, even by by the time of independence, and when Sihanouk basically came to power as the king ruling an independent country after 1954. And he then did proceed to develop education and establish a much more expanded education system in Cambodia. This was, of course, not the reason why he fell out with the United States. He also developed a neutral policy, a foreign policy of neutrality in relation to the United States intervention in Vietnam, South Vietnam, next door, and also in relation to Thailand. Both Vietnam and Thailand had intervened in Cambodia before the French had done it. And to a certain extent, the French had a more developed, successful colonization of Cambodia because of the background of Thai and Vietnamese threats to Cambodia in the past, and indeed attempted colonizations of Cambodia from both Thailand and Vietnam, which made some Cambodians feel that French power was preferable to their Southeast Asian neighbours taking over. But this problem, after the French withdrawal in 1954, returned with the South Vietnamese and Thai ambitions to influence Cambodia, and with Sihanouk as the king, and then as the virtual president, having abdicated in favour of his father, developing a neutral policy towards the United States, but with Thailand and South Vietnam both being allies, close allies of the United States, particularly after the coup in Bangkok in 1957, the Sarit regime in Bangkok, as well as the Siem regime in Saigon, both attempting to develop their influence over Cambodia, and Sihanouk very much resisting that and strengthening his neutral policy through the 1960s. The United States did, to some extent, back, for instance, the attempt by Saigon to even meddle in Cambodian affairs, and that only strengthened again Sihanouk's policy of neutrality and his recognition not only of South Vietnam but also of North Vietnam in that neutral policy, and his relationship with the Vietnamese communists in South Vietnam, the NLF or Viet Cong. And so this didn't please the United States either.
So by the time we're dealing with the rising tensions between the U.S. and Sihanouk into the 50s and 60s, you're seeing these Cambodian students come back from Paris, who will, of course, go on to become the leaders of the Khmer Rouge, among them Saloth Sar. What were the sort of biographical and ideological factors that, forged their ideas, and also what indicators and factors were there for their eventual extremism that, obviously could not be found in, say, their Vietnamese neighbors or really many other communist movements to that level at all? Well,
firstly, I did mention Tu Samut, who was known earlier as Achar Sok, the Buddhist layman who had involved in the Buddhist Institute back in the early 30s, later went on to become the leader of the communist movement in association with the Vietnamese-dominated Indochina Communist Party. He became leader of the communist movement of Cambodia. And he was a very different figure. He was from a rural background, Buddhist background. He was relatively willing to work with the Vietnamese in resisting French colonial rule, particularly the French attempt to reconquer Cambodia after World War II, when the Japanese had displaced the French, and then the French attempted to return to Cambodia and oust Son Ngoc Thang, the other member I mentioned from the former Buddhist Institute, who had become prime minister under the Japanese. The French had arrested him and taken him back to France and put him in confinement there. The French had then re-established their control in the late 40s over Cambodia. And Tu Samut was one of the Cambodians who worked with the Vietnamese and the Indochina Communist Party to resist that French reconquest of Cambodia. And the other members of that group were also, in large numbers, Buddhist. They were rural, and they were from relatively unprivileged backgrounds. Now, the group that you mentioned, the ones who were already, by the late 1940s, studying in France, Cambodians like Salot Sol, who later became known as Pol Pot, were quite different. They were relatively privileged Cambodians. Salot Sol himself, although born in a village in Kompong Tom province, at the age of 6, he went to grow up in the royal palace in Phnom Penh. His elder brother, Lot Suom, was the protocol director of the royal palace. His family had royal connections. His elder sister, Nikmani Groom, was a consort of King Monivong, the predecessor to King Sihanouk, who we've already mentioned, in the 1930s. And he had other royal family connections as well. So Pol Pot, as the young boy Salot Sol in the 1930s, grew up in the royal palace. And he developed an aristocratic bearing, kind of gentility, and a sense of assurance that stood him in good stead for when he not only gained a scholarship to study in France from 1949 to 1953, but where he joined the Communist Party, the French Communist Party, there. And when he returned to Cambodia in 1953, in the last year of the Indochina, the first Indochina War, he felt like he deserved a high rank, a leading role in the anti-French resistance, which he had not played a leading part in, but felt that he had a right to contribute to the leadership of. And so he joined the others like Tu Samut and other Cambodian communists working with the Vietnamese, but he felt like he was slighted for not being immediately promoted to high rank. He eventually became number 3 in the party, and from 1960 on, and in 1962, Tu Samut mysteriously was killed. It's not clear or it's not absolutely certain that Pol Pot contributed to his death, for instance, by revealing his whereabouts to Sihanouk's police, which were headed by Lon Nol, who later would overthrow Sihanouk in 1970. But the evidence does point to Pol Pot's involvement, certainly, if not in his Tu Samut's death, but certainly in Pol Pot vaulting from number 3 to number 1 by launching a false rumor implicating Nguyen Chia, the number 2, who would normally have taken the place of Tu Samut as number 1. But Nguyen Chia was implicated in the false rumor that Salot Sol, later Pol Pot, launched, and was unable to take the number 1 position, which Pol Pot then took, and became leader of the party in 1960. Excuse me. And so it's clear that Pol Pot was very ambitious, and that with the help of his other French classmates, such as Yang Sari, who married the sister of the woman that Pol Pot married, so they were brothers-in-law, and both studied together in France. These two, as well as Nguyen Chia, whom Pol Pot had bypassed as number two of the party. The three of them and others were to rule the party from then on.
And what year were there, clandestine activity? And what year did their clandestine activity start, heating up? Eventually, they fled to the jungles because the Sihanouk government released a list of enemies, basically, I want to say in the middle of the 60s. And then what was that like for them in the jungles, both the leadership and the rank and file, and what effect did that have on them?
Well, it's important to note that when Pol Pot and Ieng Sary returned from France, they obtained secure positions in government schools as teachers. They were not particularly harassed. It was more the lower ranking, but more veteran communists, lower ranking in the sense of a lower ranking social class. People like Toussaint, who were more threatened by Sihanouk and Lonnel's police. The people who'd studied in France were given more prominent positions in Sihanouk's educational system, and even taught in private schools, like Ieng Sary's wife was the principal of one of them. They were much less threatened by Sihanouk's police than were the traditional communists, the veteran communists who fought against the French and were basically trying to live underground. They were at a disadvantage in living and working in Sihanouk's Cambodia compared to the ones who'd studied in France, like Pol Pot and Ieng Sary, or those who'd studied in Thailand, for that matter, such as Nguyen Chia, the number two, who worked with Pol Pot from 1963 on. So they had an advantage, these foreign educated, relatively radical, and more privileged Cambodian communists compared to the more moderate, less extreme, less privileged, rural and Buddhist background veteran communists. And so it was the former group that took over the party in the early 60s and mid-60s. And so when they did so, they took the party underground into the rural areas. They left in 1963. Nguyen Chia was still, I think, relatively angry that he had not been promoted to number one from number two, and he didn't go into the forest with Solotso, Pol Pot and Ieng Sary. It took him a number of months before he joined them there, but he has been was loyal to them after that. The others, however, who had studied in France but were more moderate, for instance, Hu Yun and Hu Nim and others, they participated in Sihanouk's regime, like others, the ones I mentioned who studied in France, who were given positions in the government. Hu Yun and Hu Nim were selected to be members of parliament, and they supported Sihanouk's neutral foreign policy, and they also participated, tried to get Sihanouk's government to be more reformist and to pursue its educational development programs, and so on. Hu Yun in particular was elected for the Assembly, the Parliament, in 1958 and re-elected in 1962. And then again in 1966, he stood for election, but now he was considered too radical by Sihanouk, who opposed him, as well as Sihanouk also opposed Hu Nim, another leftist. But they both stood anyway and were re-elected resoundingly, along with Khieu Samphan, a third Paris-educated leftist. And Hu Yun, in fact, got 78% of the vote in his electoral district in 1966. So he was elected 3 times. But then in 1967, there was an uprising led by Salat Sor and Nguyen Thier and the people in the forest who had not cooperated with Sihanouk's regime. They didn't support his neutral foreign policy, and they were trying to overthrow his regime. And so Sihanouk then turned on the public members of the left who were in the assembly, in the parliament, and Hu Nim and Hu Yun's lives were threatened, and so was Khieu Samphan. And the 3 of them then took to the forest 4 years after Pol Pot had done so. And so the Sihanouk regime became much more conservative and dominated by Lon Nol, who eventually himself overthrew Sihanouk in 1970 and ended the Kingdom of Cambodia and declared the Khmer Republic and cited the United States.
Perfect transition to our next question about Mr. Lon Nol. We try to walk through different aspects of his policy, the nature of his relationship with the Americans. It was obviously a very dysfunctional government, so we go into all of that, but we wanted to ask you in particular, because we, of course, talk about the anti-Vietnamese pogroms that he initiated and the mass deportations, which I believe also included, if I'm remembering Elizabeth Becker's work right, it includes ethnic Chinese as well. And we also go into these numbers quoting you. Could you give us a bit of a sense of what these racial or racist campaigns of Lon Nol were like? And I was also curious what his approach was to the Muslim Cham minority, because they'll be a target of the Khmer Rouge. I was wondering what their status was under Lon Nol as well.
I believe the answer to that is no, that the Lon Nol's ideology, which what he called neo-Khmerism, was one of the ideological features of Lon Nol's thinking and his regime. Lon Nol and his neo-Khmerism included non-Vietnamese of all different races, and he wanted to expand the Khmer territory, including taking over the Mekong Delta and parts of Thailand, even that were inhabited by Khmers. And he foreshadowed Pol Pot's policy in that way. But he also had a more expansive vision of the races that were related to Cambodians. The Chams, of course, were not related. They're more related to the Malays, and their language is related to Malay than they were to Cambodians. But Lon Nol wanted to include the Chams. He was viciously repressive of the ethnic Vietnamese minority in Cambodia, as you mentioned. And the French embassy in Cambodia during these, what you call pogroms in 1970, which was started by the Lon Nol regime against the ethnic Vietnamese minority of Cambodia. The French embassy investigated and deliberated on what was happening and concluded that it was likely genocide, what Lon Nol was conducting against the ethnic Vietnamese. But I don't believe he conducted a similar policy against the Chams, the minority of Muslims in Cambodia. So that these were serious massacres, more than pogroms, I would say, genocidal massacres against Cambodia's ethnic Vietnamese, and many of them fled. There were 500,000 or so in Cambodia of a population of 7.5 million or so. About 500,000 were ethnic Vietnamese in Cambodia, and about half of them fled to South Vietnam as a result of these massacres conducted by Lon Nol's army.
When at least in the West, when the words Cambodian genocide come to mind, it really is essentially describing the years of the Khmer Rouge. They're identified with that event or that name or that concept. Do you think that, in any sense, the idea of genocidal activity in Cambodia could be dated earlier, given despite the drastically different types of governments carrying it out, given the anti-Vietnamese massacres by Lon Nol, the campaigns really should that period be included in the spectrum of the events of the Cambodian genocide?
Well, I think that the French embassy in Phnom Penh in 1970 was probably correct in determining that the Lon Nol regime massacres of the ethnic Vietnamese were genocide. But I think it was a different historical development than what happened in 1977 and 78 after the Pol Pot regime took power. And I think, as I mentioned, it was not accompanied by large-scale other massacres, including, as in the case of the Pol Pot regime, genocidal massacres of the Cham minority as well, the Muslim minority in Cambodia, which was what happened under the Pol Pot regime, but didn't happen under the Lon Nol regime. And secondly, I would say it was also under Lon Nol quite different from what happened under the Pol Pot regime after 75, in the sense that the massacres of the general population under Pol Pot, which were found in the UN-sponsored tribunal to have been a case of, or multiple cases of, the crime against humanity of extermination. Mm-hmm. That sort of massive crime against humanity at the level of extermination, not specifically genocide as a legal concept, but extermination as a legal concept, something related, didn't happen in the Lon Nol regime. There were massacres and killings and atrocities conducted by the Lon Nol regime. And of course, there was also the massive US bombing of Cambodia that began in 1969. Well, sorry, it began in 1965, in fact. But the B-52 bombing, the strategic bombing, began in 69 and continued until 73 and led to between 50,000 and 150,000, I would say more than 100,000 Cambodians were killed by that US bombing in the Lon Nol period mostly. Also needs to be taken into account. Certainly war crimes were conducted, committed by the Lon Nol regime. But I would say that's a different historical development than what happened in the Pol Pot regime.
Just a question, there's perhaps a smaller point, but it would be good to pinpoint for our listeners. We obviously discuss Operation Menu and the secret bombings of Cambodia before the outright invasion the next year, but we do mention that there were bombing raids in the Johnson years. However, more sporadic they look by comparison. Could you give a brief idea of the extent of those earlier bombings by the U.S. in Cambodia and what their purposes were in the Johnson years?
Yes, they began in 1965, and they were accompanied by on-the-ground patrols, secret U.S. military patrols into Cambodia, alongside the not strategic but tactical bombing by attack aircraft, not B-52s, not high-flying strategic aircraft from 65 onwards. And the Cambodian foreign minister complained about this at the time in 1965. It was on the record that Cambodia objected to the killing of our people. I can't remember the exact quotation, but I published it and written about it. The number of casualties was not small. It was, in the hundreds, at least in 1965, at the time that Cambodia's foreign minister publicly complained about it. So the bombing, the tactical bombing that began with in 65 did inflict civilian casualties, not just casualties of Vietnamese communist troops hiding out in Cambodia across the border, who were the ostensible targets of the US bomb. And these bombing raids, tactical US bombing raids, went on until 69, when the Nixon administration then escalated in a secret bombing campaign, as you called, you correctly called it the Menu campaign, which brought in strategic B-52 bombing, much more serious and heavy bombing campaign that extended the US bombing of Cambodia from 1969, from I think March 1969, right through that year and into 1970, and escalating up until 1973 with the heaviest bombing.
All right, that is the first half of our conversation with scholar Ben Kiernan. Tune in for our second part, where we get into the years of the Khmer Rouge, emptying the cities, and the human cost of their years in power.